There is a place where the Tiber River narrows. For thousands of years, this was the lowest point where one could cross on foot without a boat. Stand there today, and you might not think much of it, a muddy ford, reeds bending in the current, water birds calling across the shallows. But consider for a moment what this simple geographical fact meant to the people who first settled these 7 hills rising from the river plain. They controlled something precious. The salt route ran here, the Via Salaria, carrying white gold from the coastal marshes inland to the mountain peoples. Whoever held this crossing commanded the flow of that essential mineral, the currency of preservation, the substance that kept meat from spoiling and gave flavor to bread. It was not conquest that first made Rome important. It was position. The early Romans understood something profound about power, that it begins not with the sword, but with the place where paths must converge. They built their settlement at a crossroads, and from that junction they would eventually command the world. We know little for certain about Rome's founding in 753, before the Common Era, but we know this: the first Romans were not conquerors. They were farmers, shepherds, traders, practical people who recognized opportunity when the ground beneath their feet presented it. The 7 hills offered defense, the river offered water and transportation, the ford offered control. From these simple advantages, an empire would grow. The early kings, if they existed as more than legend, established patterns that would echo through centuries. The Etruscan Tarquins brought something transformative to this collection of hilltop villages: urban planning. They taught the Romans to think not just about today's shelter, but about tomorrow's city. They showed them how to drain the marshy ground between hills, creating the forum that would become the heart of republican government. They introduced the arch, that elegant solution to the problem of spanning space, and with it the possibility of monumental architecture. Imagine the labor involved: thousands of workers digging channels through clay, hauling stones from quarries, fitting them into curves that would bear impossible weight. This was engineering not merely for function, but for permanence. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, still flows today 2,700 years after its construction. That longevity was intentional. The Romans built for eternity because they imagined their city standing forever. But infrastructure alone does not make an empire. What happened in 509 before the Common Era changed everything. The aristocrats of Rome made a decision that would define their civilization for half a millennium. They overthrew King Tarquin the Proud and declared they would never again submit to the rule of a single man. They called their new system res publica, the public thing, a government belonging to the people rather than a monarch. This was not democracy as we might imagine it. This was something more complex, more carefully balanced. The Senate emerged as the strategic mind of Rome, 300 aristocrats, men of property and lineage, providing continuity across the generations. They advised, they debated, they remembered. While elected magistrates came and went, serving terms measured in months or years, the Senate remained, accumulating institutional knowledge, thinking in decades rather than election cycles. The consular system reflected Roman paranoia about tyranny. 2 consuls shared supreme executive authority, each able to veto the other. They served for just 1 year. The message was clear: power must be divided, limited, temporary. And yet, and here is where Roman genius showed itself when true emergency threatened, when war came to their gates and swift decision mattered more than careful debate, they could appoint a dictator with absolute authority for 6 months, flexibility within structure, control balanced against necessity. Consider the wisdom in this arrangement. The Romans understood that different situations required different approaches to power. Peace allows for debate and consensus. Crisis demands swift action. By building both possibilities into their system, they created a government that could adapt without breaking. But the most consequential Roman innovation had nothing to do with government structure. It concerned a simple question: what do you do with defeated enemies? When Rome conquered the Latin peoples surrounding them, they did something unusual. Rather than enslaving the defeated or imposing harsh tribute, they offered them a choice: become Roman citizens with full legal rights, or become Roman allies with autonomy but obligations for military support. This policy of incorporation transformed warfare from a zero-sum competition into a system for accumulating strength. Every victory added not just territory, but manpower. The Samnites of the mountains, tough warriors accustomed to rough terrain, became Roman allies, and then, eventually, Romans themselves. The Greek cities of southern Italy, wealthy and sophisticated, brought not just their soldiers, but their culture, their philosophy, their knowledge. Each defeated people became a new reservoir of strength for the next campaign. By 264 before the Common Era, when Rome first faced Carthage across the Mediterranean, the Romans controlled the entire Italian peninsula. But controlled hardly captures the reality. They had created something more like an organism, with Rome as the head and the Italian peoples as the body, diverse, but increasingly united in purpose and identity. This transformation did not happen peacefully. Within Rome itself, the city divided between patricians, the old aristocratic families, and plebeians, the common citizens who formed the backbone of the army. The conflict between these classes could have torn the Republic apart in its infancy. It nearly did, several times. Plebeians would march out of the city and refuse to return, essentially going on strike, leaving Rome defenseless until their demands were met. The creation of the tribune of the plebs represented a characteristic Roman solution. Give the common people their own magistrate, sacred and inviolable, with the power to veto any action by patrician magistrates. Let them have their voice. The law of the 12 tables followed written law that applied to everyone, carved into bronze tablets displayed in the forum where any citizen could read them. Justice would not be arbitrary, not merely the whim of aristocrats who knew traditions the common people did not. These concessions, and they were concessions, extracted through threat of violence, prevented revolution. The patricians gave up just enough power to keep the plebeians invested in the system. It was compromise born of necessity, but it created strength. A city divided between classes that cooperate is more powerful than a city divided between classes at war. Walk through the archaeological remains of Roman roads today, the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Aemilia, and you are walking on the physical manifestation of this strategy. These roads connected Rome to her colonies, to her allies, to the cities and peoples who had become part of the Roman system. They carried not just troops and trade goods, but ideas, laws, and identity. The Romans planted colonies at strategic points throughout Italy, miniature Romes, settlements of Roman citizens given land and tasked with holding key locations. These colonies were not just military garrisons, they were transplanted pieces of Roman culture, spreading Roman customs, Roman language, Roman law into regions that had never known them. A man living in a colony in the hills of Samnium might never see the city of Rome, but he was Roman nonetheless, protected by Roman law, voting in Roman elections, serving in Roman legions. This network of roads, colonies, and alliances created what we might call strategic depth. When enemies came, and they would come, Rome could draw upon resources scattered across the entire peninsula. When one region was devastated by war, others remained intact, providing soldiers and supplies. The system was redundant, resilient, robust. But resilience requires more than structure. It requires the will to endure, to continue fighting when defeat seems inevitable, to trust the system even when individual battles are lost. The Romans possessed this quality in abundance. They had learned it through generations of hard fighting against the hill tribes, the Etruscans, the Gauls who once sacked their city in 390 before the Common Era. They had learned that military defeats were temporary setbacks, not final verdicts. This psychological preparation would prove essential. For across the Mediterranean, another power was rising. Carthage, city of merchants and sailors, masters of the sea, wealthy beyond Roman imagination. The Phoenician colony controlled North Africa's coast, southern Spain, and the western Mediterranean's islands. Their navy was the finest in the world. Their merchant fleets connected distant shores, bringing tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, silk from distant Asia. Rome and Carthage were fundamentally different civilizations. Rome built its power on disciplined infantry and political incorporation. Carthage built its wealth on trade and maintained its power through naval superiority and mercenary armies. The two systems, expanding outward from their respective bases, were bound to collide. In 264 before the Common Era, they did. A minor dispute over Sicily, hardly important in itself, became the trigger for a conflict that would last more than a century and determine the future of the Mediterranean world. The Romans called these conflicts the Punic Wars, from Punicus, their word for Phoenician. Standing at the edge of history, watching Rome in that moment, we might not have wagered on Roman victory. Carthage controlled the seas. Rome was a land power that barely had a navy. Carthage was wealthy, sophisticated, experienced in international affairs. Rome was still learning to think beyond Italy. But the Romans possessed something Carthage did not: the manpower reserves and institutional resilience they had spent centuries building. The conflict would test every element of the Roman system: their military adaptability, their political cohesion, their ability to absorb losses and continue fighting, their capacity to learn from defeats and innovate solutions. It would reveal whether the strategic foundations they had built over 5 centuries were solid enough to support the weight of empire. The stage was set. The crossroads at the Tiber, chosen by shepherds who needed a ford, would become the center from which roads spread to every corner of the known world. The city on 7 hills, built by kings who drained swamps and taught their people to think in terms of infrastructure, would challenge the greatest naval power of the age. The Republic, created by aristocrats who feared tyranny, would prove whether balanced government could compete with autocracy in an era of total war. Everything they had built would now be tested, and the world would never be the same. There is a particular kind of problem that faces every civilization as it grows. Success breeds confidence, but confidence without adaptation breeds vulnerability. The Romans understood this intuitively. Their military system, evolved through centuries of fighting in the hills and valleys of Italy, was about to face its greatest test, not on familiar ground, but on the open sea against an enemy who had mastered naval warfare for generations. The Manipular Legion represented Roman thinking at its finest, where the Greek phalanx demanded flat ground and perfect coordination, thousands of men moving as one dense block. Shields locked, spears extended, the Roman system embraced flexibility. They organized their soldiers into maniples, small units of 60 to 120 men that could operate independently yet coordinate when necessary. These maniples deployed in a checkerboard pattern, like the squares on a game board, each unit able to advance, retreat, or pivot without disrupting the whole. Imagine the advantage this provided in Italy's broken terrain. A phalanx meeting a hillside becomes a disorganized mob. A Manipular Legion simply adjusts, units flowing around obstacles like water finding its path. When fighting the Samnites in the mountains, this flexibility meant the difference between victory and annihilation. The Romans had learned to make the ground their ally. But in 264 before the Common Era, when they declared war on Carthage over Sicily, the ground disappeared beneath their feet. The Mediterranean stretched before them, vast, unpredictable, controlled by an enemy whose ships had sailed these waters since before Rome existed. The Romans had virtually no navy. The Carthaginians had perfected naval warfare over centuries. It seemed an impossible mismatch. What happened next reveals something essential about Roman civilization. Faced with Carthaginian naval superiority, they did not despair or retreat. They studied. According to ancient accounts, a Carthaginian warship ran aground on Italian shores. The Romans examined it the way a physician examines a patient methodically, thoroughly, learning every detail of its construction. Then they did something extraordinary. They built 330 warships in 60 days. Consider the logistics involved. Every plank had to be cut, shaped, fitted. Every joint had to be sealed against the sea. Every ship needed oars, sails, rigging, anchors, the accumulated knowledge of generations of shipbuilding, compressed into 2 months of frantic construction. They mobilized forests, shipyards, carpenters, laborers. The entire Italian alliance contributed resources. It was a massive industrial undertaking, perhaps the first of its kind in Western history. But building ships was not enough. The Carthaginians had professional naval crews who had trained since childhood. Roman soldiers barely knew how to swim. So the Romans changed the nature of naval combat itself. They invented the corvus, the raven, a boarding bridge with a heavy spike at its end. When a Roman ship approached a Carthaginian vessel, the corvus would drop, the spike would pierce the enemy deck, and suddenly the naval battle became a land battle. Roman legionaries would storm across the bridge and fight hand to hand, using the skills they had perfected in Italy's hills. It was not elegant. The corvus made ships unstable in rough seas, and Rome lost fleets to storms. But it worked. At Mylae in 260 before the Common Era, the Romans won their first major naval victory. They had transformed their weakness into strength by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The First Punic War dragged on for 23 years, a grinding, exhausting conflict that tested both civilizations' endurance. Sicily became a battlefield of sieges and skirmishes. Fleets clashed and sank. Armies marched and countermarched. The Romans lost 700 ships to storms and combat, yet kept building more. Carthage, despite its wealth, gradually found itself unable to match Roman persistence. When peace finally came in 241 before the Common Era, Sicily became Rome's first province outside Italy, a new kind of possession, governed not as an ally but as a subject territory paying tribute. The pattern was set. Conquest would lead to provincial administration, which would generate revenue, which would fund more conquest. But the peace was merely an intermission. The real drama was still to come. 23 years after the First War ended, a Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca died fighting in Spain, leaving his son to inherit his command and his hatred of Rome. The son's name was Hannibal, and he would become Rome's nightmare, the enemy against whom all others would be measured. The general whose tactics military academies still study 2,000 years later. In 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal began his march. He left Spain with an army that included war elephants, those massive beasts that struck terror into soldiers who had never seen them. His route took him through southern Gaul, and then impossibly over the Alps in autumn. Ancient writers tell us he lost perhaps half his army to cold, avalanches, and hostile mountain tribes. The elephants suffered terribly. Most died in the crossing. But Hannibal persisted, driven by strategic vision and personal vendetta. When he descended into northern Italy, he commanded perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, a small force with which to challenge Rome. But Hannibal understood something the Romans had yet to learn. that battles are won by psychology as much as numbers. He invited Rome's Italian allies to join him, promising liberation from Roman domination. Some did, others wavered, watching to see if this Carthaginian could truly defeat the power that controlled the peninsula. The Romans met him with confidence. Their legions had conquered Italy and defeated Carthage once already. At the Trebia River in 218, at Lake Trasimene in 217, they attacked with traditional tactics, solid infantry formations advancing to engage the enemy. Both times, Hannibal outmaneuvered them with cavalry sweeps and ambushes, turning Roman strength into vulnerability. 15,000 Romans died at Trebia, 15,000 more at Trasimene, trapped between the lake and Hannibal's army in a morning fog, and then came Cannae. On the 2nd of August, 216 before the Common Era, Rome assembled the largest army it had ever fielded, perhaps 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. They outnumbered Hannibal nearly 2-1. Surely, the Senate reasoned, sheer mass would crush the invader. The consuls deployed in traditional formation, infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, the entire army advancing like an unstoppable wave. Hannibal saw the Roman plan and turned it into their destruction. He deployed his infantry in a crescent, curving toward the Romans. When the Roman center advanced, it pushed into that curve, penetrating deeper and deeper. The Romans thought they were winning. They were actually being enveloped. Hannibal's cavalry swept away the Roman horsemen, then circled behind the Roman infantry. The crescent became a vice. Closing from all sides, 80,000 Romans found themselves trapped in a shrinking space, unable to use their weapons effectively, pushed together so tightly that men suffocated under the weight of bodies. 50,000 Romans died that day. It remains one of the most complete tactical victories in military history, a smaller force not merely defeating but annihilating a larger one through superior positioning and understanding of how soldiers react under pressure. Rome stood defenseless. Hannibal's cavalry commander reportedly urged him, "March on Rome. In 5 days you will dine on the Capitoline Hill." Every rational calculation suggested that Rome would surrender or be destroyed. But Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused even to discuss terms. When Carthage sent envoys to negotiate, Rome sent them away without an audience. Instead, the Senate did something that Hannibal, for all his tactical genius, had failed to anticipate. They changed strategies entirely. Rather than face Hannibal in open battle, Rome appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius implemented what would be called the Fabian strategy: avoid pitched battles, shadow Hannibal's movements, harass his foraging parties, deny him supplies, prevent him from besieging cities. It was frustrating, unheroic, and effective. The Romans mocked Fabius as the delayer, but his strategy bought time for Rome to mobilize its deepest resource: the Italian alliance system they had spent centuries building. Most of Rome's Italian allies remained loyal. They had been incorporated into the Roman system, become stakeholders in its success. When Hannibal invited them to rebel, most declined. That decision sealed Hannibal's fate. Without local support, his army became an island in hostile territory. He could win every battle, but never win the war. Rome mobilized with staggering efficiency. They fielded 25 legions simultaneously, over 250,000 men under arms, an unprecedented effort that required conscripting allies across Italy and Sicily. They sent armies to Spain to cut Hannibal's supply lines. They reinforced Sicily to prevent Carthaginian reinforcement. They raised taxes, melted down temple treasures, did whatever was necessary to sustain the war effort, and through it all, they kept learning. A young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics and recognized a fundamental truth. Defeating Hannibal in Italy was not victory. True victory required attacking Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy to defend his homeland. It was strategic thinking on a Mediterranean scale, the kind of long-term planning that looks beyond immediate battles to ultimate outcomes. In 204 before the Common Era, Scipio landed in North Africa with an army. Carthage panicked and recalled Hannibal from Italy the first time in 15 years he had left. The two generals met at Zama in 202, and this time Hannibal faced an opponent who understood his methods. Scipio deployed in a formation that absorbed the Carthaginian elephant charge, then used cavalry to envelope Hannibal's army. The student had learned from the master, and the master had no answer. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Surrender all but 10 warships, pay enormous tribute, give up Spain and all Mediterranean islands, and never wage war without Roman permission. Carthage, once Rome's equal, became Rome's dependent. But Rome was not finished. In the decades that followed, Carthage slowly rebuilt its commercial prosperity. By 150 before the Common Era, the city had recovered enough wealth to make Roman senators nervous. Marcus Porcius Cato ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the same phrase: "Furthermore, I think Carthage must be destroyed." It was not strategic necessity that drove Rome to the Third Punic War. It was a mixture of fear, greed, and the realization that commercial competition was a form of rivalry too. When Rome finally besieged Carthage in 149, the city resisted for 3 years. When it fell in 146, the Romans systematically demolished it. They killed or enslaved the population, burned the buildings, and in a gesture heavy with symbolism, allegedly sowed the ground with salt so nothing would grow there again. The destruction of Carthage signaled a transformation in Roman thinking. They were no longer merely defending Italy or securing borders. They were building an empire, eliminating rivals, extracting wealth from conquered territories. The Spanish silver mines enriched the Roman treasury. Slaves from conquered regions flooded into Italy, working vast agricultural estates, while small farmers, the backbone of the old army, lost their land and migrated to Rome seeking work. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. The Senate became an oligarchy of families enriched by conquest and provincial governorships. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, attempted land reform to restore the small farmer class and rebuild the traditional military base. They proposed distributing public land to poor citizens, recreating the citizen-soldier economy that had made Rome strong. The Senate murdered them both. Tiberius in 133, Gaius in 121. Political violence entered Roman politics not as an aberration but as an accepted tool. The precedent was set. When disputes could not be resolved through institutions, they would be resolved through force. The Republic's foundations were cracking under the weight of its own success. But that transformation was still gathering momentum. For now, Rome stood supreme. The Mediterranean, once divided among competing powers, had become a Roman sea. The wealth of continents flowed to Italy. The legions that had adapted from phalanx to maniple, from land to sea, from defense to conquest, stood ready to march wherever the Senate directed them. They had learned to build ships in 60 days. They had learned to endure catastrophic defeats and continue fighting. They had learned to think strategically across vast distances and long timelines. Most importantly, they had learned that military victory translated into economic profit, which funded more military campaigns, which generated more profit, a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion that seemed, in that moment, unstoppable. The system they had built worked magnificently, and that very success was creating the conditions for its eventual collapse. There is a paradox at the heart of successful systems. The very qualities that enable growth and triumph often contain the seeds of eventual failure. Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean created wealth, power, and glory beyond anything its founders could have imagined. But success brought transformation, and transformation brought crisis. Consider what conquest meant for a Roman general. In the Old Republic, a consul commanded an army for a single year, won his battles, or didn't, and returned to civilian life. But as Rome's wars moved farther from Italy, campaigns stretched across years. Generals spent seasons, even decades, with the same soldiers. Bonds formed that transcended official structures. Soldiers looked to their commander not merely as a temporary leader appointed by the state, but as their patron, their protector, the man who would secure their future. This shift in loyalty fundamentally altered the Republic's balance of power. The Senate had designed the system to prevent any individual from accumulating too much authority, but they had not anticipated what would happen when generals commanded not the state's army, but their own legions, men whose fortunes were tied to their commander's success rather than the Republic's welfare. Gaius Marius embodied this transformation. In 107 before the Common Era, facing war against the Numidian king Jugurtha and Germanic tribes threatening Italy, Marius reformed the Roman army in ways that would echo through the Republic's final century. He opened military service to the Capite Censi, those counted by head alone, the propertyless poor who had previously been excluded from the legions. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. The old citizen-soldier class had been decimated by decades of warfare and displaced by slave labor on aristocratic estates. Rome needed soldiers, and the urban poor needed employment. But this reform severed the ancient connection between military service and property ownership. Soldiers no longer fought to defend their farms. They fought to earn land through their general's influence. Their loyalty shifted from the abstract concept of the Republic to the concrete person of their commander. Marius himself demonstrated this new dynamic. He was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, violating the old norms that limited men to a single consulship or mandated years between terms. The Senate grumbled but could not prevent it. Marius commanded popular support and, more importantly, commanded the legions. Political power was beginning to flow from military authority rather than constitutional office. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, learned the lesson thoroughly. In 88, before the Common Era, when the Senate transferred command of the war against Mithridates from Sulla to Marius, Sulla did something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. He marched his legions on Rome itself. Roman soldiers, who had sworn oaths to defend the Republic, attacked the city they were meant to protect because their general ordered them to. Imagine the psychological rupture this represented. For 500 years, the worst crime imaginable was threatening the Republic from within. Sulla shattered that sacred boundary as easily as breaking a clay pot. He seized control, reversed the Senate's decision, and marched east to fight his war. When he returned years later, he marched on Rome again, declared himself dictator, and initiated proscriptions, systematic murders of his political enemies. Their names posted in the forum, rewards offered to anyone who brought their heads. Thousands died. Their property was confiscated and distributed to Sulla's veterans. The message was clear. Constitutional government had failed. Real power came from controlling armed men willing to kill on your behalf. Sulla eventually retired, attempting to restore the Republic after breaking it, but the precedent was set. The sword had proven mightier than the law, and ambitious men were watching. The first triumvirate emerged from this transformed political landscape. In 60 before the Common Era, 3 men, Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar, made a private arrangement to pool their resources and dominate the Republic. It was not a legal institution. It was a conspiracy of power holders, recognizing they could accomplish more through cooperation than competition. Pompey brought military glory and popular support. He had conquered the East, bringing unprecedented wealth to Rome and reorganizing entire regions under Roman administration. His veterans needed land, but the Senate blocked his arrangements. He needed political leverage. Crassus brought wealth beyond calculation. He had made fortunes in real estate, buying burning buildings during fires which his private fire brigade would then extinguish. He controlled silver mines in Spain. He financed political careers and expected returns on his investments. But wealth alone did not translate to political dominance in a military age. He needed allies. Caesar brought ambition and political genius. He was a patrician who courted the common people, an aristocrat who understood the power of popular support. He had spent himself nearly into bankruptcy gaining political offices. He needed both money and opportunity. He needed a chance to command armies and win the glory that brought power. The three men made a simple calculation. Together they controlled enough votes, enough money, and enough veterans to dominate the state. They carved up offices and provinces among themselves. The Senate could object, but could not prevent it. The Republic's constitutional machinery continued functioning, but real decisions were made in private meetings between the three. Caesar received the province of Gaul, modern France and Belgium regions partially conquered but not fully pacified. To most observers, it seemed a backwater assignment, less prestigious than the East, where Pompey had won his glory. But Caesar saw opportunity where others saw marginal territory. Gaul contained wealth, manpower, and the chance for military reputation. He would spend 8 years there, transforming himself from a political operator into one of history's great military commanders. The Gallic Wars were not simply military campaigns. They were Caesar building an army loyal to him personally, accumulating wealth to finance political ambitions, and creating the legend that would make him unassailable. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in simple, direct Latin and distributed in Rome, were propaganda masterpieces, presenting Caesar as the civilizer bringing order to barbarous peoples, the general who cared for his soldiers, the Roman extending the Republic's glory. The campaigns were brutal. Modern estimates suggest 1 million Gauls died and another million were enslaved. Caesar crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory and the Channel to Britain, not for strategic necessity, but for prestige. No Roman general had done these things before. Each achievement enhanced his reputation and his soldiers' loyalty. His legions were becoming his instrument, bound to him by shared hardship, distributed loot, and personal charisma. Meanwhile, the triumvirate was fracturing. Crassus, jealous of military glory, launched a campaign against Parthia, Rome's rival empire in the east, and died in humiliating defeat at Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era. His death removed the balancing force between Caesar and Pompey. The two remaining triumvirs circled each other warily, each too powerful for the other to eliminate, neither willing to submit. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had been the human connection binding them. When she died in childbirth, that bond severed. The Senate, recognizing the growing threat of Caesar's power, maneuvered to ally with Pompey. They demanded Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They knew that without his legions, Caesar would be vulnerable to prosecution for illegal actions during his consulship, actions taken at the triumvirate's direction, but for which he alone could be held accountable. Caesar faced a stark choice: obey the Senate's summons and face certain prosecution, probable exile, possible death, the fate of a private citizen without protection, or refuse, keeping his army, and be declared an enemy of the state. It was not really a choice at all. It was a trap with only one escape route. On January 10th, 49 before the Common Era, Caesar stood at the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province of Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law forbade generals from bringing armies into Italy. Crossing with his legions would be an act of war against the Republic. According to ancient accounts, he hesitated, then quoted a Greek phrase, "Let the die be cast." With that, he crossed. Civil war began not with a great battle, but with a symbolic transgression, the breaking of a boundary that existed more in law than geography. A river barely 20 feet wide became the line between constitutional government and military dictatorship. The war itself was less a contest than a procession. Most of Italy supported Caesar, or at least did not resist him. Pompey retreated to Greece, where he could mobilize the East's resources. Caesar followed, and at Pharsalus in 48 before the Common Era, he defeated Pompey decisively. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge and was murdered by Egyptian officials who hoped to gain Caesar's favor by presenting him with his rival's head. Caesar wept when they showed him, or so the story goes. Perhaps he genuinely mourned the man who had been his son-in-law and partner. More likely, he recognized that Pompey's assassination robbed him of the chance to display clemency, that political tool he wielded so effectively. Caesar's policy throughout the civil war was to forgive his enemies, to offer them positions in his new order, to demonstrate that he bore no grudges. It was brilliant politics. Mercy costs less than vengeance and wins more supporters. But the Senate saw his clemency as condescension. They had been masters of the world, and now they required a dictator's forgiveness to retain their positions. Many accepted Caesar's generosity while hating him for needing to grant it. Marcus Porcius Cato, representing the old republican ideal, chose suicide over accepting Caesar's pardon. His death became a moral statement. Better death than life, in a world where one man's will superseded law. Caesar accumulated unprecedented powers. He became dictator, perpetuo dictator, in perpetuity, violating the 6-month limit that had made the office tolerable. He reformed the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar we still use today. He planned massive construction projects, colonial settlements, even a campaign against Parthia to avenge Crassus and match Alexander's eastern conquests. He wore purple, the color of kings, and allowed honors that approached divine status. Some whispered he intended to make himself king, that most hated title in Roman tradition. On the Ides of March the 15th in 44 before the Common Era, approximately 60 senators participated in his assassination. They stabbed him 23 times in the theatre of Pompey, at the foot of Pompey's statue. The conspirators called themselves liberators, claiming they had saved the Republic from tyranny. They imagined that killing the tyrant would restore the old constitutional order, that Rome would celebrate their action and return to senatorial government. They were catastrophically wrong. The Roman people did not rally to the assassins. They mourned Caesar. His veterans demanded vengeance. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant, displayed the blood-soaked toga and read Caesar's will, which left gardens to the public and money to every Roman citizen, and turned the crowd into a mob. The liberators fled the city they thought they had saved. What followed was not restoration, but chaos. Caesar's heir, his 18-year-old great-nephew Octavian, arrived in Rome claiming his inheritance. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, controlled the armies. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus commanded legions in Spain and Gaul. The three formed the second triumvirate, unlike the first. This one was legally constituted with extraordinary powers. They divided the Roman world among themselves and initiated proscriptions like sulas, eliminating opponents and confiscating wealth to fund their armies. Cicero, the Republic's greatest orator and defender of constitutional government, found his name on the lists. He fled, but was caught and killed, his head and hands cut off and displayed in the forum where he had spoken so eloquently about law and justice. The republic he defended was already dead, though its corpse would continue twitching for years to come. At Philippi, in 42 before the Common Era, the triumvirate's armies defeated the liberators. Brutus and Cassius, the assassination's leaders, committed suicide. The republic's last defenders were gone. What remained was a power struggle between the triumvirate's members to determine who would rule the Roman world. The conflict was inevitable. Lepidus proved weak and was sidelined. Antony controlled the wealthy East and allied with Cleopatra, Egypt's queen, combining resources and ruling as a Hellenistic monarch. Octavian held Italy and the West, portraying himself as defender of Roman tradition against Eastern decadence. The two former allies prepared for final confrontation. At Actium in 31 before the Common Era, Octavian's fleet defeated Antony and Cleopatra. Both committed suicide the following year. Octavian stood alone, master of the Roman world, facing the same question that had destroyed Caesar. How do you rule an empire that still believes it is a republic? The republic's structural collapse was complete. Every attempt to restore it had failed. The Senate could not govern an empire. Constitutional limitations could not restrain generals commanding loyal armies. Political violence, once unthinkable, had become routine. The system that had conquered the Mediterranean could not survive its own success. Something new was needed, and Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, would provide it not by restoring what had been lost, but by creating something that had never existed, all while claiming to restore the ancestral republic. The genius of his solution would determine whether Rome's story ended in civil war's ashes or transformed into something even more remarkable. There are moments in history when everything depends on perception. Not truth, but appearance. Not power itself, but how power is presented and understood. Octavian faced such a moment in 27 before the Common Era. He controlled Rome's armies. He commanded loyalty from legions across the Mediterranean. He possessed wealth extracted from Egypt, the richest kingdom in the ancient world. He was, in every meaningful sense, Rome's absolute ruler, and yet that was precisely what he could not admit. The Romans had murdered Caesar for appearing to want kingship. They had 5 centuries of republican tradition telling them that monarchy was tyranny, that one-man rule inevitably corrupted, that liberty required shared government. Octavian understood that he could not simply declare himself king or dictator, or any title that smelled of autocracy without risking the same knives that had killed his great-uncle. He needed to rule without appearing to rule. He needed to transform the republic into an empire while claiming to restore republican government. His solution was brilliant in its subtlety. He did not seize a single office that granted total power. Instead, he accumulated multiple republican offices, each legitimate, each with precedent, each granted by the Senate. He became princeps, first citizen, a term that implied leadership among equals rather than domination. The Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, a religious term rather than a political one. He held tribunicia potestas, the tribune's power, which made his person sacred and gave him the right to veto any action. He commanded the armies as proconsul of multiple provinces simultaneously. He controlled the treasury. He appointed provincial governors. None of these powers was unprecedented individually. Together, they created monarchy in everything but name. And because Octavian never claimed to be king, never wore a crown, never declared the republic dead, the Romans could pretend that their ancient system of government continued unchanged. It was a magnificent fiction, and both Augustus and the Senate participated in maintaining it. Consider the genius of this arrangement. The senators retained their prestige, their titles, their seats in the Senate. They could tell themselves they were still Rome's rulers, still making decisions about law and policy. Meanwhile, Augustus made the actual decisions but phrased them as suggestions, as advice, as humble requests that the Senate, in its wisdom, usually accepted. He gave the aristocracy the appearance of power while keeping its substance for himself. It satisfied their dignity while securing his control. Augustus reorganized provincial administration with systematic thoroughness. Under the Republic, provincial governorships had been prizes awarded to senators who used them to extract wealth through corruption and overtaxation. Provinces were looted, governors returned rich, and Rome's subjects groaned under exploitation. Augustus changed this by creating salaried governorships with fixed terms and accountability. Governors who oppressed their provinces faced his displeasure, and his displeasure meant the end of careers, if not lives. He divided provinces into two categories: senatorial and imperial. Peaceful, settled provinces remained under Senate control, maintaining the fiction of shared governance. But provinces with legions, where real power resided, came under Augustus's direct authority. This meant he controlled the armies while allowing the Senate to pretend it retained significant authority. Once again, appearance and reality diverged in a way that served Augustus's purposes. The Praetorian Guard represented another elegant solution to a fundamental problem. Augustus needed protection against assassination, but a large royal guard would announce him as monarch. So he created a modest force, 9 cohorts of elite soldiers, ostensibly to keep peace in Italy, but actually to protect his person and intimidate potential opponents. They were stationed just outside Rome, close enough to deploy quickly but not so obviously present as to appear threatening. Future emperors would expand the guard and bring them into the city itself, but Augustus understood the importance of appearing modest even while arranging his security. The legions themselves underwent transformation. Augustus reduced their number from over 60 to 28, creating a professional standing army rather than the massive temporary forces the Republic had mobilized. He stationed them at frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, where they faced external threats while remaining distant from Italy's politics. This was defensive thinking on a continental scale. Rome would no longer expand indefinitely, but would hold defensible borders, using rivers and deserts as natural barriers. He also confronted the succession problem that would plague the empire throughout its existence. In a republic, succession happens through elections. In a monarchy, it happens through heredity. But Augustus had created something in between, and he never solved how to transfer his accumulated powers legitimately. His obvious heir, his nephew Marcellus, died young. His friend and General Agrippa married Augustus's daughter Julia and seemed positioned to succeed, but he too died before Augustus. Eventually, Augustus adopted his stepson Tiberius, a capable general but an unloved figure, essentially because alternatives had been eliminated. The pattern was troubling. Each time a promising heir emerged, he died, sometimes from natural causes, sometimes under suspicious circumstances. The palace politics of the Augustan household produced schemes, poisonings, and exiles that would have made a Hellenistic court blush. Julia, Augustus's only child, was exiled for adultery, though the charges probably masked political intrigues. Tiberius succeeded not because he was chosen for merit, but because he was the last man standing. This established a dangerous precedent. If emperors could not reliably pass power to capable successors, if inheritance depended on survival in palace intrigue, then the imperial system contained a fatal weakness. Good emperors might be followed by incompetent ones, not because Romans wanted bad rulers, but because family dynamics and court politics determined succession rather than merit or public choice. Tiberius's reign demonstrated the system's dependence on the emperor's character. He was militarily competent and administratively capable, but he was also paranoid, suspicious, and eventually misanthropic. He ruled effectively at first, but gradually withdrew from Rome to the island of Capri, governing through letters, while the Senate stumbled through business without clear direction. The treason trials began accusations of disloyalty, often prompted by informers seeking to confiscate accused persons' property. Fear spread through the aristocracy. Friendship with the wrong person could mean death. When Tiberius died in 37 of the Common Era, Rome celebrated. But his successor, Caligula, proved worse if the ancient accounts are accurate. Young, inexperienced, possibly mentally unstable, Caligula allegedly attempted to make his horse a consul, declared himself a living god, and committed random acts of cruelty. The Senate endured 4 years of his reign before the Praetorian Guard assassinated him. Here the system revealed another weakness. If the emperor was killed, who chose the successor? The Senate might claim that authority, but actual power resided with those who controlled armed force. The Praetorian Guard found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate had no choice but to accept this. The precedent was set. The Praetorian Guard could make and unmake emperors. Claudius surprised everyone by ruling competently. He was physically awkward, possibly suffering from cerebral palsy or some neurological condition that made him drool and stutter. The aristocracy had dismissed him as a fool, but he proved to be a capable administrator who expanded the empire by conquering Britain, adding a province that Julius Caesar had merely raided, and reorganizing imperial bureaucracy. He created offices staffed by freedmen who owed everything to him personally, building an administrative apparatus that did not depend on the aristocracy. Unfortunately, his palace was a nest of intrigue. His wife Messalina was executed for plotting against him, or perhaps for humiliating him with her public affairs. The sources disagree. His next wife, Agrippina, brought her son Nero from a previous marriage and maneuvered to make him heir instead of Claudius's own son Britannicus. When Claudius died, possibly from poisoned mushrooms, Nero became emperor at 16, with Agrippina expecting to rule through him. Nero's reign began promisingly. Guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, young Nero ruled moderately and showed interest in arts and culture. But as he matured, he began making his own decisions, and they were catastrophic. He allegedly had his mother murdered when she became too controlling. He had his wife executed. When fire destroyed much of Rome in 64 of the Common Era, rumors spread that Nero had started it to clear space for his planned palace, the Golden House. He blamed Christians, members of a new, mysterious sect, and initiated the first imperial persecution of them. Nero's true passion was performing. He sang, acted, raced chariots, and competed in festivals. To Roman aristocrats, this was degrading an emperor should command, not entertain. But Nero loved the applause, the artistic expression, the freedom to be something other than administrator-in-chief. He was, perhaps, the wrong person in the wrong job, a performer forced into politics. His reign ended with military revolts, the Senate declaring him an enemy of the state, and his suicide in 68, reportedly lamenting as he died. What an artist the world is losing. The year of 4 emperors followed a brutal demonstration that the imperial system had never solved the succession problem. When Nero died without an heir, multiple generals proclaimed themselves emperor. Galba, Otho, Vitellius each ruled briefly before being killed by rivals. Legions in different provinces supported different candidates, and armies marched on Rome or on each other. Civil war threatened to tear the empire apart just 70 years after Augustus had established peace. Vespasian emerged victorious, not because of superior legitimacy, but because his legions were better positioned and more numerous. He was a practical, middle-class soldier from an equestrian family, not an aristocrat, not connected to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His elevation proved that anyone with sufficient military backing could become emperor. Birth mattered less than force. Vespasian and his sons, the Flavian dynasty, stabilized the empire through competent administration and military success. He famously joked on his deathbed, "I think I am becoming a god," mocking the pretensions of imperial divinity while acknowledging its political usefulness. His son Titus completed the Jewish war, destroying Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. The triumph and the treasure financed Rome's most famous monument, the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheatre, where gladiators would fight and die to entertain the masses and legitimize the dynasty through public generosity. The Colosseum itself embodied the imperial system's logic. Emperors provided bread and circuses, free grain, and entertainment, buying popular support and preventing unrest. The arena, where criminals, prisoners of war, and professional fighters died for spectacle, was not barbarism but policy. It channeled Roman violence into controlled settings, displayed imperial power and wealth, and gave common citizens a stake in the regime through free entertainment. An emperor who could fund magnificent games was an emperor worth supporting, regardless of how he acquired power. Titus ruled briefly and was beloved, dying after just 2 years. His brother Domitian succeeded and ruled competently but autocratically, demanding to be addressed as Lord and God and executing senators he suspected of disloyalty. When the Praetorian Guard and palace officials tired of his paranoia, they assassinated him in 96, ending the Flavian dynasty. But they had learned, this time, instead of chaos, they arranged succession beforehand. They convinced the elderly Senator Nerva to become emperor with the understanding that he would adopt a capable successor. The Senate approved, the armies accepted, and a new principle emerged: adoption of the most capable candidate rather than hereditary succession. This would produce the empire's greatest rulers, but it worked only so long as emperors were willing to choose merit over blood. Human nature would eventually reassert itself, but for a century, the adoption system would give Rome its golden age. The imperial system, for all its flaws, had achieved stability. The endless civil wars that destroyed the Republic had been replaced by occasional succession crises. The empire could endure bad emperors because the administrative machinery continued functioning regardless of who sat on the throne. Provinces paid taxes, legions guarded frontiers, roads connected distant cities, and Roman law governed millions. The system was larger than any individual, even the emperor who nominally controlled it. Augustus's constitutional fiction had worked. By pretending to restore the Republic while creating monarchy, he had given Romans what they needed: strong central authority, while allowing them to believe they retained what they valued: republican tradition. Future generations would recognize the empire for what it was: autocracy dressed in republican costume. But the costume mattered. It provided continuity, legitimacy, and a shared story that held together a vast, diverse realm that might otherwise have dissolved into competing kingdoms. The question now was whether this system could maintain itself indefinitely, or whether internal contradictions would eventually produce collapse. The answer would unfold over the next 3 centuries, as Rome reached its maximum extent and then began the long, complicated process of transformation that we call decline and fall, but which was actually something more interesting: adaptation, reorganization, and the gradual metamorphosis of one civilization into the seeds of many others. There are systems that reach a kind of perfection, not eternal, not invulnerable, but optimized for their moment. The Roman Empire in the 2nd century of the Common Era achieved something close to this ideal. From the Scottish Highlands to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic coast to the Euphrates River, Roman law governed, Roman roads connected, and Roman peace, the Pax Romana, allowed trade and culture to flourish on an unprecedented scale. This was not accidental. It was the result of institutional learning, careful administration, and a sequence of rulers who understood that empire required more than military force. Nerva's adoption of Trajan in 97 marked the beginning of what later historians would call the Five Good Emperors, though there were actually more than five, and good is perhaps too simple a word. What made them effective was their recognition that the empire had become too large and complex for personal whim to govern successfully. They were administrators as much as autocrats, engineers of a system that operated according to principles rather than personalities. Trajan was not Roman by birth. He came from Spain, from a provincial family, and was the first emperor born outside Italy. This itself represented something profound, that Roman had become an identity transcending birthplace, that the empire could be led by men from its peripheries. Trajan understood military logistics, having spent his career in the legions. He understood provincial administration, having governed multiple regions. Most importantly, he understood the delicate balance between expansion and consolidation. His conquest of Dacia, modern Romania, between 101 and 106 of the Common Era, demonstrated strategic thinking at its finest. Dacia possessed gold mines, vast wealth that had allowed its king Decebalus to threaten Rome's Danube frontier. Trajan's campaigns were not mere military adventures, but calculated investments. The gold extracted from Dacian mines financed his subsequent building programs, improved soldiers' pay, funded grain subsidies, and generally enriched the imperial treasury. Conquest paid for itself, and then some. But Trajan also recognized limits. His campaign against Parthia, Rome's rival empire in the east, pushed Roman control to the Persian Gulf, the empire's maximum extent. He captured the Parthian capital Ctesiphon, but holding these eastern conquests required constant warfare, constant expenditure, constant attention. The empire was reaching its logistical limits, the point where adding territory cost more than it produced. When Hadrian succeeded Trajan in 117, he made a controversial decision. He withdrew from some of Trajan's eastern conquests. He recognized strategic overextension when he saw it. Rather than maintaining indefensible salients deep into Parthian territory, he established stable, defensible frontiers. This was not weakness but wisdom, understanding that empires can grow too large, that at some point expansion becomes vulnerability rather than strength. Hadrian's walls embodied this philosophy. In Britain, he built a barrier stretching 80 miles across the island's narrowest point, from sea to sea. In Germany, he erected palisades and fortifications along the frontier. These walls were not impermeable, no wall keeps out determined invaders, but they controlled movement, channeled trade through customs posts, and established clear boundaries between Roman civilization and the lands beyond. They said, "Here is Rome, here is not Rome, and we will defend the distinction." Hadrian traveled extensively, more than any emperor before him. He spent years visiting every province, inspecting defenses, settling disputes, showing himself to soldiers and civilians alike. This personal attention projected imperial power more effectively than any distant decree from Rome. When the emperor himself appeared in your city, listened to your concerns, and made decisions affecting your life, imperial authority became tangible, immediate, personal. He was also deeply Hellenophile. He loved Greek culture, philosophy, and art. His villa at Tivoli was an architectural museum recreating famous buildings from across the Greek world. When his beloved Antinous drowned in the Nile Companion, lover, perhaps more Hadrian, founded a city in his honor and established a cult deifying him. This was Roman power used for personal grief, but also a demonstration that emperors could reshape reality through will and resources, declaring humans divine because they commanded the apparatus to make it so. Antoninus Pius, who succeeded Hadrian in 138, ruled for 23 years without leaving Italy. Where Hadrian travelled constantly, Antoninus governed from Rome, trusting his appointments, maintaining Hadrian's policies, avoiding unnecessary wars. His nickname Pius suggested dutiful respect for tradition. He was the emperor as administrator-in-chief, competent but not dramatic. His reign was so peaceful, it seems, almost boring in historical accounts. And perhaps that was the point. The best government might be the kind you barely notice, that maintains order without constant crises. But peace has costs that compound silently. The empire was not expanding. Provincial wealth was not growing significantly. The tax base remained stable but did not increase. Meanwhile, maintaining frontiers, paying soldiers, building fortifications, replacing equipment consumed steady resources. The empire was no longer enriching itself through conquest but spending accumulated wealth on maintenance. The trajectory was sustainable but not indefinite. Marcus Aurelius, who became emperor in 161, embodied Stoic philosophy, the idea that one should accept what cannot be changed while fulfilling duty regardless of personal preference. He wrote his meditations in Greek, philosophical reflections on impermanence, duty, and the nature of existence, while commanding armies on frozen Germanic frontiers. Reading his private thoughts, you encounter a man who did not want to be emperor, who found warfare distasteful, who longed for philosophical contemplation but spent years in military camps because duty demanded it. His reign faced challenges that previous emperors had largely avoided. The Antonine Plague struck the empire between 165 and 180, possibly smallpox or measles, encountering a population with no immunity. Ancient sources lack precision, but modern estimates suggest the disease killed millions, perhaps 5 million, perhaps 10 million, perhaps more. Urban areas suffered worst. The legions, concentrating men from diverse regions, became vectors for transmission. Trade routes that had spread prosperity now spread death. Consider what this meant for imperial finances. Dead citizens pay no taxes. Abandoned farms produce no crops. Depleted legions cannot defend frontiers. The empire's administrative machinery continued functioning, but its human capital was devastated. Recovery would take generations if it came at all. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes pressed against the Danube frontier with increasing intensity. They were not necessarily more aggressive than before, but Roman weakness invited opportunism. Marcus Aurelius spent the last decade of his life campaigning along the frontier, fighting wars that achieved no glory, produced no conquests, but were necessary to maintain territorial integrity. He died in 180 in a military camp, still fighting, his Stoic philosophy tested by circumstances he could not control. His decision to make his son Commodus co-emperor violated the adoption principle that had given Rome its good emperors. Marcus had biological sons, previous good emperors had not, which made adoption necessary. Some historians argue Marcus betrayed the system by choosing blood over merit. Others suggest he recognized that dynasty provides legitimacy, that the empire needed hereditary succession to prevent civil war over succession. Perhaps he simply loved his son and hoped for the best. Commodus was not the best. He was vain, cruel, and more interested in performing as a gladiator than governing an empire. He fought in the arena, sometimes against disabled opponents or terrified criminals who could not defend themselves, and demanded applause for his courage. The Senate endured him for 12 years before palace conspirators strangled him in 192, ending the Antonine period in assassination and confusion. The civil war that followed the Year of the Five Emperors demonstrated that the succession problem remained unsolved. Septimius Severus emerged victorious, founding the Severan dynasty. His alleged deathbed advice to his sons revealed his philosophy. enrich the soldiers and scorn all others. He understood that imperial power rested on military loyalty, that whoever commanded the legion's allegiance commanded the empire, that civilian institutions existed at the sufferance of armed force. This was not cynicism, but realism. The adoption system had worked only because emperors voluntarily participated in it. When they chose blood over merit, when succession became contested, military force determined outcomes. Severus militarized the state, raising soldiers' pay, expanding the army, and making the legions the primary stakeholders in the imperial system. It was effective short-term policy. His dynasty ruled for 40 years, but it shifted the empire's center of gravity from civilian administration toward military autocracy. His son Caracalla extended citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 through his famous edict. This was presented as generous policy, making everyone Roman, but it had practical motivations. Roman citizens paid certain taxes that non-citizens did not. By universalizing citizenship, Caracalla expanded the tax base to finance military expenditures. Citizenship, once a jealously guarded privilege that meant something profound, became a fiscal category that meant everyone owed more taxes. The edict's symbolic importance was real. It meant a merchant in Egypt, a farmer in Gaul, and a craftsman in Syria were all equally Roman under law. But it also diluted citizenship's meaning. When everyone is Roman, being Roman becomes less distinctive, less valuable, less motivating. The empire was becoming more administratively unified, while becoming less culturally coherent. The Severan dynasty ended in murder and chaos, as most dynasties did. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of disaster that tested whether the Roman system could survive sustained pressure. Between 235 and 284, the empire had at least 26 legitimate emperors and countless usurpers. Most died violent deaths. Few ruled longer than a few years. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into imperial territory. The Goths sacked cities in Greece. The Franks and Alemanni devastated Gaul. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire, more aggressive than the Parthians, they replaced captured Emperor Valerian in 260, using him as a footstool and eventually killing him. A Roman emperor became a Persian king's furniture. The humiliation was absolute. Plague returned, killing millions more. Inflation destroyed currency value, emperors debased coins to pay troops, prices spiraled, and trade based on stable currency collapsed. Provinces broke away. The Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, each claiming they could protect their regions better than the central government. The empire was fragmenting, unable to defend frontiers while maintaining internal order. Consider what this meant for ordinary people. Roads became dangerous as banditry increased. Cities built walls they had not needed for centuries. Trade declined. Farms were abandoned. The prosperity of the Antonine Age seemed like a distant dream. The system that had optimized itself for peace and administration was poorly suited for sustained crisis. Yet the empire survived. Soldier emperors like Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian fought back, defeating invaders, reuniting provinces, stabilizing currencies. They were not cultured administrators like Hadrian or philosopher kings like Marcus Aurelius. They were hard men from frontier provinces who understood warfare and survival. The empire was adapting, shedding the pretenses of civilian government and becoming what it needed to be. A military autocracy focused on defending what remained rather than expanding further. The crisis revealed the empire's resilience but also its vulnerability. The institutions Augustus created, refined by the 2nd century emperors, were robust enough to survive sustained pressure, but they required competent leadership, adequate resources, and favorable circumstances. When all three disappeared simultaneously, the system strained to breaking. It had not broken, not yet, but the cracks were visible, and everyone could see that something fundamental had changed. The empire's greatest days were behind it. What lay ahead was not collapse, but transformation into something different, something harder, something adapted to a world where survival mattered more than prosperity. There are moments when systems require complete reimagining, when incremental reforms cannot address fundamental problems, when the old ways no longer work. Someone must have the courage or desperation to tear down and rebuild. Diocletian, who seized power in 284 of the Common Era, faced an empire that had nearly destroyed itself. His response was to transform Roman government so thoroughly that historians mark his reign as the beginning of a new era. The Dominate, when emperors stopped pretending to be first citizens and openly ruled as domini lords and masters. Diocletian came from humble origins in Dalmatia, rising through military ranks, through competence and ruthlessness. He understood the crisis's core problem. The empire had become too large for one man to govern effectively. When Germanic tribes invaded the Rhine frontier, the emperor might be fighting Persians on the Euphrates. When usurpers appeared in Britain, the legitimate emperor might be defending the Danube. The imperial system required the emperor to be everywhere simultaneously, which was impossible. His solution was radical. He created the Tetrarchy rule by 4. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to rule the west while he controlled the east. Each Augustus then appointed a Caesar as junior emperor and designated successor. The 4 rulers divided the empire geographically, each responsible for defending his region and suppressing usurpers. In theory, this quadrupled administrative efficiency while solving the succession problem through pre-designated heirs. Consider the logic. Rather than one overstretched emperor with armies scattered across 3 continents, 4 emperors each commanded regional forces and could respond quickly to local threats. Rather than succession crises erupting after each emperor's death, the junior Caesars would smoothly ascend to Augustus while appointing new Caesars. The system provided both immediate military efficiency and long-term political stability. In practice, it worked magnificently for exactly 20 years, until Diocletian retired. The Tetrarchy's success depended on all 4 rulers accepting their roles and cooperating rather than competing. This required either extraordinary personal discipline or the dominating presence of a figure like Diocletian who could enforce cooperation. Once he abdicated in 305, the system collapsed into civil war almost immediately. Succession problems multiplied by 4 rather than being solved. But Diocletian's administrative reforms endured. He separated civil and military authority, ensuring provincial governors could not combine administrative control with command of legions, the combination that had enabled so many usurpers. Civilian governors administered, military dukes commanded, and neither could rebel without the other's cooperation. It was divide and rule applied to the empire's own structure, reducing the risk of regional secession. He also reformed taxation, attempting to create predictability for both government revenue and taxpayer obligations. The Annona system required provinces to provide specific quantities of grain, olive oil, and other supplies rather than monetary taxes, a response to currency instability. It was rational policy, but it also bound peasants more tightly to their land, beginning the process that would eventually create medieval serfdom. His persecution of Christians represented a different kind of problem-solving. Christianity had grown substantially since Nero's time, creating parallel structures of authority bishops, councils, churches that operated outside imperial control. Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, the divine spirit that protected Rome. To Diocletian's orderly mind, this was disloyalty, potentially sedition, certainly disrespect for imperial authority. Between 303 and 305, he ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the execution of Christians who refused to sacrifice. It was the last and greatest persecution, an attempt to eliminate what he saw as a threat to unity and order. It failed completely. Christianity was too widespread, too deeply rooted, too organizationally robust. You could kill bishops, but new ones were ordained. You could burn books, but believers memorized scripture. You could destroy buildings, but congregations met in homes. The persecution created martyrs, and martyrs inspired conversions. Diocletian retired thinking he had solved the Christian problem. Within a decade, a Christian would sit on the imperial throne. Constantine's rise to power followed the predictable pattern: civil war among the Tetrarchy's successors. He defeated rival after rival, consolidating control of the West. In 312, facing Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge near Rome, Constantine supposedly saw a vision, a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether the vision was real, imagined, or invented later, Constantine placed Christian symbols on his soldiers' shields and won the battle decisively. His subsequent conversion to Christianity was one of history's most consequential decisions. Was it genuine religious experience or strategic calculation? Probably both. Constantine's genius was recognizing that Christianity offered something the traditional Roman religion could not: ideological unity backed by organizational infrastructure. The Roman gods were a collection of local cults and mythological stories, useful for ritual but not for binding diverse peoples into common purpose. Christianity was a coherent worldview with universal claims, hierarchical organization, and passionate believers willing to die for their faith. By supporting Christianity, Constantine gained access to the church's administrative networks, bishops who already governed communities, churches that served as meeting places, charitable organizations that commanded loyalty. He gained ideological legitimacy as God's chosen ruler, rather than merely the general with the most legions. He gained an empire-wide institution that could help govern, spreading his will through church hierarchy as effectively as through civil administration. The decision transformed both empire and church. Christianity went from persecuted minority to imperial religion within a generation. Constantine granted Christians legal recognition, returned confiscated property, exempted clergy from taxes, and funded church construction. He built basilicas in Rome, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, his new capital in the east. These were not modest chapels but monumental structures proclaiming Christianity's triumph and imperial power's majesty simultaneously. Moving the capital to Constantinople in 330 was equally strategic. Rome was symbolically important but geographically peripheral. The empire's wealth and threats centered on the east: Egypt's grain, Syria's trade, Persia's armies, the Danube frontier. Constantinople, built on the site of ancient Byzantium, controlled the straits between Europe and Asia. It was defensible, prosperous, and perfectly positioned to govern the eastern provinces that generated most imperial revenue. Rome did not cease being important overnight, but power's center of gravity shifted irreversibly eastward. Future emperors would rule from Constantinople, Milan, or Ravenna, rarely Rome. The western provinces would become progressively poorer and more difficult to defend, while the east remained relatively prosperous and secure. This geographic division would eventually produce two distinct empires sharing a common heritage but diverging fates. Constantine's role in Christian theology was equally significant. The Council of Nicaea in 325 addressed a theological dispute that was tearing the Church apart: the nature of Christ's relationship to God the Father. Was Christ divine or created, equal to God or subordinate? The Arian controversy threatened to split Christianity into competing factions, undermining the unity Constantine sought. The emperor intervened personally, convening bishops from across the empire to resolve the dispute. He did not merely preside, he participated, arguing for what became orthodox doctrine, that Christ was of one substance with the Father, fully divine and co-eternal. The Nicene Creed, still recited in churches today, emerged from this council. It was theology shaped by imperial politics. Constantine needed unified doctrine for political stability, so he used his authority to impose it. This established a pattern that would define Christianity's relationship with political power. Emperors convening councils, enforcing orthodoxy, using the church to legitimize their rule, while the church used imperial power to establish correct belief. It was mutually beneficial but also ensured that theological disputes would become political conflicts, that heresy would be treated as treason, that religious difference would threaten state unity. Constantine's nephew Julian, who ruled from 361 to 363, attempted to reverse the Christian revolution. He was the last pagan emperor, educated in classical philosophy, devoted to the old gods. He withdrew state support from Christianity, attempted to rebuild pagan temples, and tried rekindling traditional Roman religion. It failed utterly. Christianity had become too deeply embedded, its organizational advantages too significant, its claim to universal truth too compelling for urban populations who formed the empire's core. Julian died fighting Persians, some said killed by a Christian in his own army, others by Persian arrows, none certain. His death proved that pagan revival was impossible. The future belonged to Christianity, not because it was philosophically superior or historically Roman, but because it offered what the empire needed: ideological cohesion, administrative infrastructure, and a transcendent purpose beyond mere political authority. Theodosius I completed the religious transformation. In 380, he declared Christianity the empire's official religion. Pagan temples were closed or converted to churches. Pagan rituals were forbidden. The Olympic Games, held since ancient times, were eventually banned as pagan festivals. What had been the empire's traditional religion became illegal overnight. Christianity triumphed, not through persuasion, but through imperial decree backed by state power. But Christianity's triumph created new problems. The church now wielded significant political power. Bishops like Ambrose of Milan could challenge emperors, demanding they submit to church authority in spiritual matters. When Theodosius ordered a massacre in Thessalonica, Ambrose forced him to perform public penance. An emperor, supposedly God's chosen ruler, kneeling before a bishop, it was a revolutionary inversion of power relationships. The theological disputes continued, now with imperial resources mobilized to suppress heresy. What counted as correct belief? Who determined orthodoxy? Councils met, decrees were issued, dissenters were exiled or executed. The same state that once persecuted Christians now persecuted the wrong kind of Christians. Arian Christianity, despite being declared heretical, thrived among Germanic tribes. The split between Latin West and Greek East began producing theological differences that would eventually divide Christianity itself. In 395, Theodosius died, dividing the empire between his two sons, Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east. It was presented as administrative division, not permanent separation, but it proved permanent. The Eastern and Western empires would never be meaningfully reunited. They would face different threats, develop different institutions, speak different languages, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, and gradually become distinct civilizations, sharing only memory of unity. The Western Empire's position was fundamentally weaker. It had poorer provinces, Gaul, Spain, Britain, Italy, compared to the East's Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. It faced worse geography, long, porous frontiers along the Rhine and Danube, rather than the East's defensible Balkan mountains and eastern deserts. It had less wealth, fewer people, and more immediate threats from Germanic tribes pressing against its borders. The East, by contrast, possessed Constantinople's magnificent defences triple, walls that would resist sieges for 1,000 years. It controlled the Mediterranean's richest provinces. It faced Persia, a dangerous rival but a civilized empire with which diplomacy was possible, rather than migratory tribes seeking land. The structural advantages were overwhelming. The religious revolution Constantine began had provided ideological unity, but could not overcome geographic and economic reality. Christianity gave the empire a shared faith, but shared faith does not produce grain for armies or gold for treasuries. It provided moral authority, but moral authority does not defend frontiers against determined invaders. The empire was Christian now, but it was also divided, weakened, and facing challenges that would test whether any amount of reorganization could preserve what Augustus had created. The stage was set for the Western Empire's final act, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow transformation, a gradual dissolution as barbarian kingdoms replaced Roman administration while claiming to preserve Roman civilization. The East would endure, becoming what we call Byzantium, guarding classical heritage while developing its own distinct character. But that story belongs to the next chapter, where we must confront what decline and fall actually meant and what survived when the Western Empire finally expired. There is a common misconception about endings. We imagine them as dramatic, a final battle, a definitive moment when everything changes. But most endings are not like that. They are processes, gradual transformations so slow that people living through them might not realize they are witnessing the end of an era. The Western Roman Empire did not fall. It faded, transformed, and was slowly replaced by something different that nonetheless claimed to be Roman. The 5th century opened with the Western Empire already weakened, but still functioning. Honorius ruled from Ravenna, not Rome, which was too exposed, but Ravenna, protected by marshes and close to the Adriatic. His general Stilicho, a half-Vandal himself, commanded what remained of effective Roman forces in the west. The army was no longer the disciplined legions of Caesar's time. It was a collection of units, many recruited from Germanic tribes, loyal more to commanders who paid them than to the abstract concept of Rome. The population was declining. Plague, warfare, and economic disruption had reduced the numbers that cities and farms could support. Fewer people meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant smaller armies and reduced administrative capacity. It was a downward spiral where each problem made others worse. The machinery of empire was still running, but every component was wearing out, and there were no longer enough resources to repair everything that broke. Germanic tribes were not invading as conquerors in these years. They were migrating, seeking refuge from other tribes, pressing behind them, a domino effect of displacement stretching back to the Huns' movement westward from the Asian steppes. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Franks, these were not barbarian hordes so much as peoples seeking security, land, and the chance to settle peacefully within Roman borders. The empire's inability to manage this migration revealed its administrative collapse. In better times, Rome had incorporated migrants, settled them on frontier lands, recruited them into the army, and gradually assimilated them into Roman culture. But the Western Empire no longer had the capacity for such systematic integration. Treaties were made and broken. Tribes were settled in one region, then moved elsewhere when local Romans objected or when the tribes decided better land lay elsewhere. In 410, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome itself. The shock reverberated across the Mediterranean. Rome had not been captured by foreign enemies since the Gauls 800 years earlier. How could the eternal city fall? Saint Augustine wrote, "The city of God," partly to address Christians who wondered if Rome's conversion had somehow caused its vulnerability, if abandoning the old gods had brought divine punishment. But the sack was not the catastrophe it appeared. Alaric's forces plundered for 3 days, but they did not destroy the city or massacre its population. They took portable wealth and left. Rome remained inhabited, its churches intact, its population recovering. The real significance was symbolic. The aura of invincibility was shattered. If Rome itself could be sacked, what did Roman power actually mean? The Western Empire's real problem was not military defeat but systemic failure. The Visigoths settled in southern Gaul and Spain, creating their own kingdom while nominally acknowledging imperial authority. The Vandals crossed into Africa in 429, seizing Rome's wealthiest provinces. Egypt's grain no longer flowed to Italy. North Africa's revenues no longer filled treasury. Each loss reduced resources for defending what remained. Each Germanic kingdom established meant less territory under direct Roman control. Aetius, the Western Empire's last effective general, exemplified the new reality. In 451, he defeated Attila the Hun at the Catalonian plains, preventing the Hunnic Confederation from conquering Gaul. It was presented as a great Roman victory, the kind of triumph that would have earned a general in earlier times a magnificent parade through Rome and perhaps a political career leading to the consulship. But look closely at the composition of Aetius's army. The majority were not Romans but Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, Germanic federates fighting under their own kings as Roman allies. Rome no longer fielded its own armies. It coordinated coalitions of Germanic peoples who had settled within former Roman territory and who fought to defend their new homes from other migrants. Rome had become a diplomatic entity rather than a military power, its authority resting on legal claims and political legitimacy rather than force of arms. When Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain commanding what remained of the Italian army, deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476, it was barely newsworthy. The 16-year-old emperor held no real power. The deposition was administrative tidying, acknowledging the reality that Germanic kings already ruled the western provinces, while maintaining polite fiction that they governed as Roman officials. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, informing the Eastern emperor that the West no longer needed its own emperor. One would suffice for the whole empire, and Odoacer would rule Italy as his patrician. It was a face-saving gesture that fooled no one, but it preserved the theory that the Roman Empire remained unified even as its reality dissolved into Germanic kingdoms. The Eastern Empire, what historians would later call Byzantium, survived robustly. Constantinople's walls held. The eastern provinces remained productive. The administrative machinery continued functioning efficiently. While the West fragmented into competing kingdoms, the East maintained centralized government, professional armies, and effective taxation. Geography, wealth, and defensible borders made the difference between survival and dissolution. Justinian, who ruled the East from 527 to 565, attempted reconquering the West. His brilliant general Belisarius defeated the Vandal kingdom in Africa, conquered the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and seized parts of Spain. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was nearly reunited under Roman authority. Maps could again show the empire stretching from Gibraltar to the Euphrates. But it was illusion masquerading as restoration. The reconquests devastated Italy. 20 years of warfare reduced its population and destroyed its economy. The effort drained eastern resources without producing corresponding revenue. The reconquered territories required subsidies to defend, becoming burdens rather than assets. Within decades of Justinian's death, most Western territories were lost again, this time to Lombards in Italy, to resurgent Visigoths in Spain. The reconquest was a magnificent failure, a demonstration that the old empire could not be reassembled through military force alone. Yet, Rome's legacy persisted even as its political unity dissolved. Roman law survived through Justinian's codification, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which organized centuries of legal precedent into systematic form. This became the foundation for European legal systems, influencing everything from property rights to contract law to judicial procedure. When medieval kingdoms needed legal frameworks, they adapted Roman law because nothing else offered such comprehensive, logical organization. The Catholic Church preserved Roman administrative principles. Dioceses were based on old Roman provincial boundaries. The Church's hierarchy mirrored imperial administration. Latin remained the Church's language, preserving the tongue even as spoken Latin evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian. Monasteries copied ancient texts, preserving classical literature that would otherwise have disappeared. Christianity, originally a threat to Roman order, became the primary vehicle for preserving Roman civilization. Medieval kingdoms claimed Roman succession. Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 represented this desire, the Frankish king crowned by the Pope as Rome's legitimate heir. The Holy Roman Empire would endure 1,000 years, its name a testament to how powerfully the Roman ideal persisted. Russian Tsars claimed the title from Caesar. Ottoman sultans called themselves successors to Rome. The idea of universal empire, of legitimate authority extending across known civilization, remained central to European political imagination for centuries. Rome's infrastructure endured. Medieval travelers walked Roman roads, cities used Roman aqueducts, bridges built by Roman engineers still carried traffic. The physical remnants outlasted the political entity, testament to construction that prioritized permanence over expedience. When Renaissance artists sought models for beauty and proportion, they studied Roman buildings. When Enlightenment thinkers imagined ideal government, they debated Roman republican institutions. The strategic innovations Rome developed became templates for later empires: professional standing armies, standardized provincial administration, legal systems applying equally across diverse populations, infrastructure investment as state policy. The concept that defeated enemies could be incorporated rather than merely subjugated. These ideas did not die with the Western Empire. They were adopted, adapted, and employed by every subsequent European power that aspired to greatness. Consider what actually ended in the 5th century. Not Roman influence, which would shape European civilization for millennia. Not Roman law, which became foundational to Western legal tradition. Not Roman engineering, whose techniques were studied and imitated. Not Latin, which remained the language of learning, law, and liturgy for 1,000 years. Not even Roman political concepts, which inspired everything from medieval kingdoms to modern republics. What ended was the unified political structure, the single state governing the Mediterranean basin. And even that ending was not total. The Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years, finally falling only in 1453, when Ottoman Turks breached Constantinople's walls. The story of Rome, properly understood, spans over 2,000 years from legendary founding to Byzantium's final defeat. The lesson here is subtle but profound. Systems do not simply collapse, they transform. They adapt to changed circumstances. They break into pieces that continue functioning independently. The Western Roman Empire's dissolution was not civilization's end, but its reorganization into forms better suited to early medieval conditions: smaller political units, more localized economies, church and monastery, replacing centralized state as primary institutions. Rome succeeded because it learned, adapted, and incorporated. It failed, if failure is the right word, because it became too large, too complex, too dependent on conditions that could not be maintained indefinitely. But its failure was not absolute. The dream of universal order, of law applying equally to all peoples, of infrastructure connecting distant regions, of civic institutions protecting individual rights, these Roman ideas persisted, inspiring every subsequent generation that sought to build something lasting. Stand today in Rome, not ancient Rome, which is fragments and ruins, but modern Rome, built atop and around the ancient city. You walk on streets following routes laid out 2,000 years ago. You see monuments that have endured centuries. You encounter legal concepts, architectural styles, political ideas, and linguistic patterns that trace directly to the people who built their settlement at a ford on the Tiber River. They were practical people who recognized opportunity, built for permanence, learned from defeats, and created institutions larger than themselves. They made mistakes, terrible mistakes that caused immense suffering. They built their greatness on conquest and slavery. They were neither heroes nor villains, but humans facing challenges, making choices, and building something that outlasted them by millennia. That is Rome's ultimate triumph. Not that it never fell, but that its fall hardly mattered. The empire ended, but Roman civilization continued, transformed but recognizable, influential still, a permanent part of how we think about law, government, engineering, and the possibility of building systems that transcend individual lives. That is what survives when empires fade, not their power, but their ideas, their innovations, their contributions to the long story of human civilization.